Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, but they also can attract people who like to play God and decide when someone else should die. Those people may act out of a need for power or excitement, but many claim they do it from compassion. They just believe that certain patients would be better off dead. It's not clear when the suspicious deaths began in the Glendale Adventist Medical Center near the Ventura Freeway in Southern California. Elderly people die every day of natural causes. It doesn't take much to push them over the edge. If they're poor or have few relatives around to remark on it, they may die without anyone noticing that something was amiss. Reporter Paul Lieberman from the Los Angeles Times described the respiratory failure of a 75-year-old woman in 1996. Her name was Salbi Asatryan, and she was an Armenian immigrant. She was taken to the hospital on December 27th for extreme difficulty with breathing, so she went right into critical care, accompanied by her worried daughters, and was stabilized. Several respiratory therapists worked with her and felt sure she would pull through and improve. They expected her to be able to leave the hospital and go home. She was even breathing on her own and feeding herself. That's why everyone was surprised when 3 days after she'd begun to look better, she was found dead in her bed. Well, not everyone. There was talk around the hospital about the night shift and the magic syringe. A few workers had their suspicions. When staff members are alone with patients and no one else is around, they're free to do as they please. Presumably, they're trustworthy and want only the best for those in their care. However, not everyone interprets that relationship in the same way, and not everyone feels a nurturing connection to their patients. Efren Saldivar became a hospital therapist, Lieberman points out, because he liked the uniform. That's not much of a reason to go into healthcare. Saldivar was born in Brownsville, Texas on September 30th, 1969. Apparently, his mother, who lived in Mexico, wanted her children to be U.S. citizens, so she went to Texas to give birth. It's not unknown, and every border state faces the dilemma of treating non-residents who come in seeking better medical care than they can get in Mexico. It's not illegal, but it drains American resources. Before he even had any awareness, Saldivar had a role model in his mother of exploiting others for her own gain and of acting with little regard for medical protocol. His father, Alfredo, moved his wife and 2 sons to Los Angeles in search of a job as a handyman. Efren's mother, Izara, worked as a seamstress. She was a Jehovah's Witness, and she raised her children to learn the faith and to spread it to others. They could get into heaven, they were told, only by piling up brownie points through their good deeds. Efren applied himself in school, but worked below his abilities. Teachers liked him because he had an extroverted personality. Then he began to observe the kids in gangs. They looked so cool and full of a form of personal power that he himself never felt. He desperately wanted to be a member. They were in high school, and he was in junior high, so that was out of the question. Then, to his disappointment, he got to high school, but all those cool dudes were gone. In fact, he didn't really fit in with anyone, not the jocks and not the scholars. He played in the band, and at 170 pounds, he was large and awkward, conspicuous in ways he disliked. Girls didn't seem attracted to him, at least not the ones he wanted, but he would become obsessed with them anyways. He'd risk ridicule by sending them intimate notes. Despite being outgoing, he had a shy side, so rejection was painful. He remained fairly withdrawn and stayed close to his family. Saldivar had no life goals to speak of. He might go to college or enlist in the military. His plans were vague, with no real sense of direction. He didn't want to start a business or work for himself, and he didn't want to work around other people. As soon as he did get a job, which was in a supermarket, he acted irresponsibly. It was just a menial job with no future, but he'd steal things from the store for other guys. In the meantime, he was not keeping up with his grades, and he ended up flunking out in his senior year, so he didn't graduate in 1987 with his class. He stayed at the supermarket and decided to just do that. It was good enough. Then he saw a friend in a uniform who was enrolled in the College of Medical and Dental Careers in North Hollywood. He wanted to look as good as his friend did. He had no particular medical aspirations, but that kind of employment seemed better than working all his life at a grocery store. He took a high school equivalency test to finish his degree and then enrolled in the technical school himself in 1988. In less than a year, he had his certification and a job waiting for him close to home. He was 19, uniformed, and ready to enter the working world. He had no interest in working as a caregiver. He saw himself as a technician. Eventually, he hoped to work on the night shift where there would be fewer people around. Part of his job was to learn to use a stethoscope and to put needles into arteries. He had to determine if patients were having difficulty breathing and if there was enough oxygen in their blood. His job also included respiratory rehabilitation and putting tubes down patients' throats when they couldn't breathe well on their own, especially during a code blue emergency. He placed people on ventilators that had to be monitored and adjusted. He had a lot of responsibility. Saldivar also did his homework. He knew a lot about drugs and computers, and he had a reputation for being able to talk with doctors about these things. He quickly developed a real knack for the work, particularly because he enjoyed talking with patients as they waited for some medication to activate and help them breathe better. They would tell him all about themselves and thank him for his help. Eventually, he went on the graveyard shift at night. Just as he'd hoped, he ended up working pretty much on his own, without supervision or much accountability. During that time, there was only one other technician like him in the hospital. Their patients were scattered, so they might work all night and rarely see each other. The work wasn't difficult, emergencies were few, and Saldivar was even able to offer his services part-time to other area facilities. It's likely now that they regret hiring him, but they were short-staffed, and he'd said he was working overtime to help pay expenses for his family. To all who knew him, he seemed like a competent, reasonable guy who was a bit awkward with women, but always willing to do a favor. He even still lived with his parents, and he'd bought his mother a car. It was difficult for many to see how his perspective was becoming warped. For a while, he took Zoloft to ease a long-standing depression, but then he stopped. That may have been a mistake. Nurses and respiratory therapists on the night shift could go in and out of patients' rooms without anyone noticing them, since during those quiet hours from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., the halls were usually empty. Besides that, people doing their medical routines would hardly come to anyone's attention. After a while, it all becomes a blur, and each person takes for granted that everyone else is doing his job, and nothing more. Yet some patients would be awake at night and needing attention, even demanding it. A few were lonely and wanted some company, but some were chronic complainers and wanted treatment anytime, day or night. It was like they were in a resort hotel with staff at their beck and call, and not all of the hospital staff appreciated that, especially when such patients showed up in the hospital time and time again. One of these was a woman named Jean Coyle. On February 26, 1997, she pressed her button to get some help, and Saldivar responded, again. He went in, and as Coyle recalled the incident to the Los Angeles Times, she blacked out. She did not know how it happened, but she came to and didn't give it another thought. Not until she heard about what was going on in that hospital. Then she viewed her experience in a different light. In April of that same year, one of the other respiratory therapists, Bob Baker, suggested to his boss that Saldivar was doing things to patients at night, injecting them with something. It isn't unusual in hospitals for people to spread rumors about others, especially when patients are dying in ways that seem inexplicable. Yet there had to be proof. Without that, no one would be suspended or fired. At that time, John Bechtold was head of the department, and he did not like Saldivar. Neither did the therapist, who had squealed. The easy thing would be to turn him in, but since their personality clashes were known, it might look like he was undermining a guy just because he didn't like him. Bechtold needed more than innuendo, so he told another supervisor what he'd heard, and together they beefed up their vigilance. Often, when a healthcare worker is viewed as an angel of death or a medical professional who kills patients, a pattern begins to show up on that person's shift. Janine Jones, working in the children's ICU in a Texas hospital, had a high incidence of respiratory arrests among children over whom she had watched and who had entered the hospital without heart problems. It turned out that she'd been injecting them with drugs like succinylcholine chloride, a muscle relaxant that suppressed breathing and could paralyze a person, because she enjoyed the excitement of an emergency. She also acted strangely around dead babies, yet the hospital administration did only a lax investigation. Then she moved on to a one-doctor clinic, and the constant cardiac arrests and seizures finally brought attention to the problem, but only after one child died. She was convicted of murder, and no one knows how many other babies she'd killed. In Saldivar's case, the records on his shift indicated nothing unusual. If he was doing something to patients, he was being careful. However, to those who worked closely with him, his shifts appeared to be jinxed. They would talk about patients who needed to die, and then that person died. Sometimes several people died in one night. Occasionally, the other therapists joked that Efren had the magic touch. What he had was the magic syringe. But eventually, he got careless. As a practical joke, a couple of the other respiratory therapists decided to put someone else's clothing in Saldivar's locker. So, on his night off, they pried it open. Someone noticed a bag, and when the contents were examined, the bag proved to contain some very potent drugs, including morphine, succinylcholine chloride, and pavulon, a drug used to stop the breathing rhythms of patients who were going onto a respirator. On a shelf inside the locker were also some empty syringes. No respiratory therapist was allowed to handle these drugs, and now they had real evidence to support their suspicions. Yet, because they discovered the stash by breaking into the locker, they remained mute on the subject. They'd reported on Saldivar the year before, and nothing had happened. Chances were good that they would get into trouble, not him. Still, they now knew that it was true that Saldivar had a magic syringe. Then one of the therapists, a female named Ursula Anderson, happened to mention Saldivar's after-dark activities to a man in a bar. His name was Grant Brosses, and he saw an opportunity to make some money. He thought it might be worth something to the hospital to have this information to keep it out of the hands of the police. Lieberman indicates that Brosses was estimating that he might be paid somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000. So, in February of 1998, he called Glendale Adventist Medical Center. He didn't even have a name to offer in this tip, but when they went down the list of almost 40 therapists who worked there, he recalled something that sounded like Saldivar's name. Since this tip had come from a source unrelated to the first one, just someone named Grant, the hospital administrators were alarmed. They felt it was time to hand the case over to the Glendale Police Department, but they also continued to conduct their own investigation. During that time, 2 more patients died in the respiratory unit. The investigator who took the case was Sergeant John McKillop in robbery homicide. He met with the 3 administrators, and they told him about the previous tip the year before. They also provided the pager number of the caller who'd left the most recent tip, so McKillop tracked him down. Then he contacted his former partner, a top detective in Glendale named Will Curry. They also brought aboard Tony Fudia, who ran a background check on Brosses. The guy turned out to have a lengthy record, which could make his so-called tip a bit suspicious. He'd done time and had participated in a range of crimes from cocaine to grand theft. Yet they still had to follow it up. If it was a good tip, they could stop a killer and save people's lives. When confronted by police, Brosses had suddenly decided that he didn't really know much, and he wasn't at all sure of the information he'd been given. It appeared to the investigators that he just didn't want to have anything to do with cops. His call had been to the hospital in an effort to be paid off for keeping quiet, and he wanted no part of a formal investigation. Given his 15 years of run-ins with the police, they could see why, but they still needed reliable information in order to move forward. Hospital administrators went through their lists and offered the possibility that Ursula Anderson had initially mentioned what Saldivar was doing. The investigators questioned her, and she insisted that she'd said no such thing. Mr. Brosses had obviously made it up. Another dead end. Yet to their credit, the investigators didn't give up. If someone was killing patients who had entrusted themselves to the care of the hospital, they were going to find out who it was. The year before, Bob Baker had mentioned the magic syringe. Perhaps he knew something more. In fact, he did. He knew about the vials of muscle relaxant found in Saldivar's locker. That observation sent Curry and crew to an expert, the director of the respiratory therapist unit, John Bechtold, who informed them about some of the rivalries in the unit, notably Baker and Saldivar. Baker could have made up his accusations to get Saldivar fired. That possibility had to be considered, which presented the investigators with a whole new problem. Bechtold mentioned that when Baker had first told them about Saldivar's late-night activities, they had run their own investigation but found no substantive proof. In light of the hostility between the two men, they dropped it. McKillop was disappointed. He reported what he knew and what he didn't know back to his chief. They decided to approach Saldivar himself to see what he'd say. The hospital had shifted some schedules to keep him away for several days, so he was available in the afternoon that Will Curry invited him to come down to the station. If he was a killer, they hoped for a reaction. But no one expected quite the one that they got, or what would happen next. Saldivar was introduced to a polygraph examiner, who asked him if he understood why he'd been asked to come in. He responded that he expected to get his name cleared. He was confused about why he'd not been back to work, and he'd heard that some anonymous caller had fingered him as a killer. He wanted to talk so that people would know he was innocent. The investigators asked him if he'd ever done anything like what he was accused of doing. At first he denied it, but then quickly admitted that he'd been injecting people since he'd started work at Glendale. The first case occurred when he was 19 and fresh out of school. He'd been assigned an elderly female patient, he said, who was on a life support system. She had a terminal case of cancer, and there was no hope for her. In fact, she was almost over the edge. The doctors would soon turn off her machines, and the family had already taken their leave. After everyone was gone, Saldivar looked in on the woman and saw that, although she was unconscious, she was still breathing. He felt sorry for her. Out of mercy, he claimed, he connected two tubes, effectively suffocating her. Then he admitted that years later, he'd injected Pavulon into one patient by shooting it through the IV tube. He'd found a discarded bottle of the stuff and had kept it. Immediately, he was read his rights, but then he continued to talk freely. Lieberman indicated that Saldivar talked for 2 hours. He said that his first lethal injection occurred in 1997. He'd only done that twice. Or, that's what he said at first. Curry mentioned that he'd probably do some investigating on his own, and Saldivar blurted out that he wasn't alone in this. There were others too. They would sometimes go from room to room, injecting people who shouldn't have to live any longer. He said he did this because he felt sorry for them. Curry asked if this involved more than 500 patients, and Saldivar assured him it was less than 50. He thought just over 40. So now, within moments, he'd climbed from 2 to 40-something, possibly 50. He had been convinced they were ready to die. To a BBC reporter later, Curry said that Saldivar's criteria for murder were that the patient had a do not resuscitate order, he or she was ready, and he or she was unconscious. He prided himself on having very ethical criteria as to how he picked victims. Saldivar may have injected both succinylcholine chloride and Pavulon, which are difficult to detect in human body tissue at autopsies and would not show up unless a specific test was done. That meant finding the illegal drugs in his possession and possibly even exhuming bodies. That evening, he was placed under arrest. The next day, the police searched his home and found plenty of pornography, but no incriminating drugs. That was bad news for the investigators. Since a person cannot be held on what they say alone, no matter how much they confess or how brutal the crime, Saldivar was released after 48 hours to await the results of a more thorough investigation. Based on this shocking information, however, Efren Saldivar was terminated on March 13, 1998, and just to be safe, the hospital suspended 37 other people in the respiratory department. Then he recanted his confession and said he hadn't really killed anyone. He'd had a mental disorder along with depression and had been pressured to confess. He just made it all up. Now, without his confession, the physical evidence would be important. McKillop formed a task force of 6 investigators and rented a house near the hospital for a command post. Then they consulted some experts on the phenomenon of angels of death. Some do it out of mercy, they learned. Some for profit. Some to look like heroes when they revive the patient. And some from a pure sadistic delight in playing God. One doctor, Michael Swango, had gone from hospital to hospital, killing just to kill. Despite what Saldivar said, the detectives learned that making someone die by using pavulon was hardly merciful. Derived from an African drug, curare, the patient went into a conscious paralysis and felt every minute of the death by suffocation process. It was no easy experience, and they couldn't even scream for someone's attention. Their throat closed up, and they had to lie there helpless until it was over. Understanding all this made them realize they had an enormous job ahead of them. They had numerous records to sort through because over 1,000 patients had died at some point on Saldivar's shift during the 8 years he'd worked at the hospital. They couldn't very well exhume all of these people, so they began to narrow the list down to recent cases, specifically those deaths that appeared to be the most mysterious. The patient had seemed okay, and where the body was still available, not cremated. It took them a year at the command post to finally settle on 20. To put Saldivar in jail for life, they only needed a few obvious murders. One by one, throughout the summer months of 1999, the investigators brought potential victims up out of the ground. The pathologists examined them and took tissue samples from the livers, bladders, and muscles, and the toxicology lab then went to work. Brian Anderson, at the Lawrence Livermore Forensic Science Center in Oakland, California, demonstrated a new scientific protocol for the proper procedure to revive and preserve the biological evidence. He concentrated on pavulon because succinylcholine chloride breaks down into elements natural to the human body, and because the test recently discovered for its detection in Sweden was expensive. Pavulon was a synthetic muscle relaxant sometimes given in low doses to patients on respirators, and it could remain detectable in the body for years. In order to prove that a homicide had taken place, Anderson and his team looked for dosage levels out of the normal range. At first, they reported only negative results, which disappointed the task force. They hoped they had not just spent a year and a half of their time for nothing. Then, Anderson got some hits. First, there were 3, and then, after the 20 exhumations were complete, he found 6 that gave positive results. In January 2001, criminal charges were prepared. The officers followed Saldivar, now 31, to work one morning on his way to a construction job, and then arrested him for the murder of 6 patients, all of them elderly, and one of them a mentally disabled woman. He was booked and reminded of his rights. He began to talk once more, but this time he said that he'd been understaffed on some shifts, so to ease the workload, he'd eliminated a few patients. As Lieberman describes it, when he was at his wit's end, he would look at the board and decide, who do we have to get rid of? He admitted that he'd killed patients at other hospitals too, where he'd worked part-time. He'd mentioned this before, but had not admitted to actually giving injections. After 60 victims, he'd lost count. He figured it was more than 100. It had just been a gradual thing, an act that had bothered him a little at first, but then he'd grown used to it and let it all slip from his mind. You don't plan it, he said to investigators. After that, you don't think about it for the rest of the day or ever. Between this confession and the evidence, it was enough to go to court. The lead prosecutor prepared the case, finding a star witness in Jean Coyle, the complaining patient whom Saldivar had attempted and failed to kill. Thus, along with the 6 murder charges, was an attempted murder charge too. Ursula Anderson, the female respiratory therapist who knew what Saldivar was doing, got immunity in exchange for her agreement to testify that she had given Saldivar the pavulon and knew what he was doing with it. Around this time, 3 full years after the murders first came to light, the Glendale Adventist Medical Center put out a statement in a press conference. They apologized to the families and assured them that they were helping the police, who had already expended thousands of man-hours with the investigation. They were disheartened by the way someone would so shockingly abuse a position of trust, especially one to which people were so vulnerable. The hospital spokesperson said that they had no idea how Saldivar obtained the drugs that he used, but as a result of this case, they had tightened their own controls and procedures. Hereafter, they would institute a mortality analysis, in which a single physician would review all records after a death, thus making it possible to spot suspicious trends and patterns. The data would be set in columns for easier visibility. They would have greater control over the types of drugs that could be used to induce death. The respiratory therapists would now be subject to the orders of a physician for the use of a ventilator. In addition, there would be computer surveillance of all ventilator settings so that the changes made would be recorded on a printed report. Any medications not used during a code blue resuscitation would be secured at the conclusion of the incident. The hospital ordered settlements, and a few families accepted. In March 2002, Saldivar pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder in exchange for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, although the prosecutor had never intended to go for the ultimate sanction. Saldivar contested nothing about the investigation and accepted his sentence, which was formally meted out on April 17th. Judge Lance Ito, who had presided over the O.J. Simpson criminal trial during the mid-90s, gave Saldivar 6 consecutive life sentences and 15 more years for attempted murder. Saldivar did offer an apology to the families. "I know there's nothing I can say," he mumbled, "that can soothe their anger or bring relief to their anxiety. I want to say that I'm truly sorry, and I ask for forgiveness, although I don't expect any." Had he been executed, Lieberman points out, he'd have been given the same drug as the one he'd used on his patients. In May 2002, the California Department of Consumer Affairs Respiratory Care Board petitioned a judge to suspend the license of Ursula Anderson. She had aided and abetted a criminal and had acted unprofessionally and with extreme neglect. 3 other therapists who worked with Saldivar were put under investigation as well. Right away, there was film interest in the story. Disney-based Spyglass partners Roger Birnbaum and Gary Barber bought the rights for a feature-length film, which plays the cold and cunning angel against the shrewd but fatigued Detective McKillop. A script is written, and production is scheduled for the summer of 2002.